Welcome to the Hembury Books Podcast. Today we have Porscia Lam, who is the author of The Unlocking, an Autism Story. Porscia is a Melbourne lawyer with over 15 years experience in large firms and financial institutions. She took a career break in 2021 to care for her two young children, one diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. The success of her son's early intervention therapy led her to write her first book, The Unlocking, an Autism Story, which was shortlisted for the Hawkeye Manuscript Development Prize this year. It's being published by The Kind Press. Porscia, thanks a lot for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Jess. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. Can you please tell viewers about The Unlocking and what prompted you to turn your story into a book?
Yes. So The Unlocking is a memoir that looks at my experience with raising my son who was diagnosed with autism at the age of 2.5. This was in August 2020, so right in the heart of Melbourne's pandemic lockdown. And the book is a part pandemic memoir, which many people will relate to. And it's also an exploration of the early intervention therapy called ABA therapy that we pursued with my son, with this goal of getting him school ready by the time he was ready for prep, which for us ended up being this year, just before he turned 6. And during this time, I took a career break. It ended up being for 3 years. Where I kind of really got involved in his therapy, and he had extreme separation anxiety. So there was no way of him doing this therapy without me being with him the whole time. And it's really time intensive. So it's recommended at 20 to 40 hours per week, which is, it's a lot. But straight away we saw really great results. But towards the start of the 3rd year, I was noticing things that suggested he was going to be able to go to school next year and I was going to be able to return to work. And I think one of the things that happens when things get better is that you sort of forget the details of how bad they once were. And I never wanted to forget that. I didn't want to forget the journey that our family had been on. So to answer your question, what prompted me to write it, it was this real need to want to document our memories and not forget this extraordinary time we had been through.
Yeah. What do they say? The Palest Ink is better than the best memory.
Yes. Great source for, a story.
Had you ever thought about writing a book? Do you love writing? Because you're a very good writer.
I do love writing. I never thought I had a story worthy of telling. Like I enjoyed writing at school. I came up with, short pieces that always did really well in sort of school competitions, but I don't think I ever dreamt of that next step, being a writer. But then when this happened, it was kind of like the perfect storyline, the perfect narrative arc with tension and characters and resolution, and it kind of just, the story fell into my lap. So I had to go for it.
My gosh, reading it, could you tell us please about some of Harry's more extreme behaviours where your book begins?
Yes. So this story is about a subtype of autism called Pathological Demand Avoidance, or PDA. It's not officially recognised here in Australia, but in the UK it is officially recognised. So you could get a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder with a PDA profile, which means that a lot of the early markers of autism are there. So we certainly had speech delay, rigidity, inflexibility, fixations. But then there was this other pattern of demand avoidant behaviour which didn't fit the usual descriptions of autism that we encountered, and it confused us for a long time. We thought, oh, maybe it's something else, maybe it's not autism, maybe there's some other explanation. So this demand avoidant behaviour, a lot of people will probably wonder, what is a demand? Like when you are a 1-year-old, what could possibly be a demand in your life? And the answer is that anything at that age can be a demand, anything from getting up in the morning to going back to bed. So getting up and getting dressed is a demand, brushing teeth is a demand, all those self-care needs like wearing shoes. There's a whole chapter on that. But anything to do with self-care, so washing hair, that was like a 1 in 10 day event for us. And when it happened, we would try our best to get his agreement, to do it, to get his consent. But actually when it happened, it was always this quite physical event where someone would just have to hold him down and wash his hair, and one of us would wash his hair. So anything to do with self-care, like changing nappies, because at that age, everything requires adult supervision or adult instruction, and immediately that becomes a demand. And so even going to the playground, which is something really pleasurable for a child, if I said, let's go to a playground, that immediately became an expectation for Harry, and he would refuse. So we'd have to come up with creative ways of sort of setting ourselves up to accidentally walk past a playground, and then he would sort of point to it and go on his terms, which would not be a demand. But some of the absolute hardest things were to do with, wearing shoes, things that would allow him to access fun activities like a normal child, but he would find ways and excuses to avoid doing that, and eventually sort of deprive himself of the normal joys of childhood.
Yeah, and the lack of eating, that was really scary. I really felt for you amidst COVID and the lockdowns, trying to find a particular type of chicken wings that he would eat. And from a nutritional point of view, I mean, I get it. My daughter's a really fussy eater. It's scary stuff, because his weight was dropping. He was not, what was he surviving on?
So how he continued to grow was mainly his meal replacement formula, which he still has today, the Pediasure formula, which, sometimes given via nasal gastric tube for people who can't eat or children who can't eat. So he drank that out of a baby bottle, and continues to do so quite a lot to supplement his diet. But the one thing that he has eaten for dinner every day for sort of over 3 years now, one of 2 brands of chicken tenders. And during the lockdown, when there were supply shortages, I mean, we remember what happened with toilet paper, right?
Yeah.
We couldn't get this one brand of chicken tender. And unfortunately for Harry, you can't just go from Steggles chicken tenders to Ingham's. Like, that is a different food. And you also can't go from chicken tenders to chicken nuggets. That is a different food. And so that kind of anxiety about how we're going to feed him, and if we can't get supply of this stock, where we're going to go. And I just remember like logging onto the computer and Googling the different supermarkets to see what their stock levels were, and just driving out there.
And you just have to break the limitation.
I had to. Look, I think I probably had an exemption because Harry had this diagnosis, but, you're never really sure what exactly the rules are around it. I just carry his diagnosis with me and just drove wherever, 20 Ks.
Stressful situations and surreal situations where you would potentially be saying to a police officer that you have an exemption to find chicken wings and just chicken tenders. Is really, I mean, it's really both you and your husband were so determined to help Harry and to find out what was wrong, and to help him live a more, fulfilling life is really, that really shines through. Your account of parenting a child with special needs, to me, it didn't feel watered down. I felt that you were completely honest with how that felt and your feelings, the resentment of not being able to live your own life, not being able to have a job. And when you got the job and then you went to the office and it was completely deserted, like a ghost town, I was like, no, I really wanted you to start working. Did you, from the beginning, decide that you were going to share, a warts and all account?
So when you asked me before what prompted me to write the book, I said it was to record my memories, which is true. But as I started writing it, and sort of 5,000 words became 10,000 and 20,000, and I realized I was going to have this book length manuscript, I sort of began to shape it and give it more of a full story. And at some point I realized I was probably writing the book that I had been desperate to try and read right at the start of our autism journey, when we were freshly armed with this diagnosis, and things were really bleak. Like, we had no therapies established. We didn't have any strategies to try. And when we were first starting to implement the strategies, it made his behaviour worse before it got better. And so, like, the book covers some pretty unsettling territory and some thoughts which are, they're unspeakable. I would never have spoken to a friend about it over a coffee, but I could write about them. I felt like there was a certain freedom when I was writing about them. And I know that thinking back to those early days, I would have really loved to have read an account like that, to know that I wasn't the only one to have thought those thoughts, and that, I had convinced myself I was the only parent to live this life and to be in these shoes. And that's simply not true. But I wasn't able to find another story at that time that connected in that way. So when I went about writing it, I was never really going to water that down, because I feel like that will be valuable to someone.
It is so valuable. I mean, I feel honoured to have been an early reader. Your book has not yet come out, but the feedback that you've got already, I think you're going to be getting some very strongly worded, positively letters from people saying, yes, you see me, Have you had any early feedback yet?
I have. Look, so I went out to some early endorsers before the book was kind of in its final form. A lot of those people were from the autism community or with therapists and paediatricians. And so they gave feedback from an expert's point of view. But since then, I've sort of approached just general book reviewers, and what's really been surprising is how accessible and engaging the book's been for people who don't know about autism. And for me, that's where there's a lot of value, because when we talk about raising awareness, it's hopefully engaging with people who aren't already engaged in the autistic community, who might be a little bit curious, or who might have family members or friends who have children diagnosed and just want to have a glimpse of what that person's going through and hopefully be supportive. So yes, the early feedback has been that it's written in a way that it's pretty accessible for just any general memoir reader, which has been really great to receive.
Yeah, no, it's exciting. I'm excited for you, Porscia. COVID is the dark backdrop of your book, and also I have to say I love the dark cover. It's really great. How did the isolation under COVID in Melbourne, the most lockdown city in the world, challenge you and your family during what was already a challenging time?
So look, COVID was a really special kind of hell for a lot of people. And some people had homeschooling, which we didn't have to deal with because our kids were too young. So I'm grateful I didn't have to deal with that. But for a lot of families that were impacted by disability, even though there were some exemptions that, for severely affected individuals, you could still get some face-to-face therapy, a lot of the supports were still ripped away. And especially when you think about something like autism, where so much of trying to keep a child regulated is about having structure and routine and predictability and sameness, that obviously all went out the window. We were in a slightly different position, which was that we received our diagnosis and we didn't have any established autism services, and no one was willing to take us on. Like, no one was onboarding new clients. And we were stuck in a pattern where we didn't know when lockdown would lift. So every time it lifted, it would come back, and then people would stop seeing you face to face. And in the back of my mind, I knew, like, in all of the literature, it says the best outcomes for autistic children is to begin therapy as early as possible and really intensively pursue the early intervention. And I guess some of the darkest moments were this fear that we were losing time and we were losing opportunity to help Harry in these early days. But then obviously there were really practical COVID issues, like the chicken tenders and like not wearing shoes. So in Melbourne, one of the things you were allowed to do was go out for 1 hour exercise each day. Like, you could run around. The playgrounds were shut for most of the lockdowns, but you could run around on the oval and kick the ball or chase the magpies or whatever. And Harry, during COVID, it was probably one of the reactions to this change of routine. He started refusing wearing shoes. and it continued for 9 months. And he wasn't that carefree kind of kid that could run around barefooted. Like, he would get a drop of water on his sock and have a meltdown, or he would get a little prickle in his sock and have a meltdown. So we kind of carried him around the whole time. We'd go for walks and someone would be carrying Harry around, this 18-kilo kid. So it was really limiting in terms of what we could do with him. He basically was, left to walk around in socks just on dry patches of ground.
Extraordinary challenge mounted upon challenge. What would your advice be for someone who's contemplating writing a book about their child, something their child is going through?
Yeah. So this was something I spent a bit of time thinking about once I'd finished the manuscript, and I thought, what am I going to do with it? Am I going to make it public? Am I going to share the story? One of the key questions was, is there anything in here that's going to embarrass him when he grows older? And I think the way I got comfortable with that was I sort of ended the story before he was 5 years old at the end of the story. And in my head, I got comfortable with that because at that age, you can get away with pretty much anything. Yes, it talks about toilet training, and he toilet trained a year and a half, 2 years later than most other kids, but really he was still 4. And it
tiny. Yeah.
And I think a lot of his behaviours, although they were autism driven, they are behaviours that other kids do at that age. It's just that he does it to a more extreme extent or more pervasively, and it impacts his every moment of every day. And so I kind of got comfortable that at that age, if I ring fence the storyline to end when he starts school, I was happy that there's nothing there that he's going to be ashamed about later on in life. What I've tried to resist doing is I've resisted in the editing rounds, because I finished the first draft of the manuscript in October last year, and I've done rounds and rounds of editing since then. I sort of had the ability to revisit parts of the book and extend and give insights into what's happened this first year of school. But I've tried to resist doing that because I feel like he's sort of at that age now when he started school that if I start talking about new habits or new behaviours, maybe that will be the behaviour that carries on into adulthood, and maybe he wouldn't have liked me to have flagged that or made it public. So I've tried to really resist the temptation to update the ending of the story. He's doing great, like he's having a 10 out of 10 experience in prep this year, but I've tried not to go into details about that. And, a lot of people blog about their children, and I find it really helpful to read other people's blogs, but I've sort of thought I've shared so much about his early life that's where I've chosen to end it, and I'm comfortable with that, and I'm pretty sure that he'll be okay with, what's been disclosed in the book.
That's a really sensitive approach. I like that approach. I think when he's old enough to read it, he'll be like, wow, my mum is a really strong person.
Yeah, and I hope, I've had friends ask me, would you let him read this book? And my answer is absolutely, when it's the appropriate age, because, he's been through so much and he's achieved so much at such a young age, and he probably won't remember a lot of the early stuff, but it's such a special story, not just for him, but for his sister and the whole family. And I absolutely want him to see the warts and all version of it when he's old enough.
Why was it important to present your own experience of ABA? And could you please explain what ABA is? This is another point of interest, I think, of your book.
Yes. So ABA, and I had never heard of it until we started looking at it.
And it's not the Australian Breastfeeding Association.
No, it's not. It stands for Applied Behaviour Analysis. It is a form of behaviour therapy that was first developed in the 1960s, and the aim of it was to help develop language and support behaviours for autistic children. So the first kind of cohort of kids to go through it probably would have been in the 70s and 80s, and things were done really differently back then. Like, I was a kid that was raised in the 80s, and I just remember parenting was very different back then. And ABA therapy, as it was run originally, involved both positive and negative reinforcement. And unfortunately, the negative reinforcement sometimes involved punishment, like physical punishment. So there's a group of autistic adults who went through quite a traumatic experience with early ABA, and are quite loudly critical of this therapy. But ABA has changed a lot. Like it's evolved with the times, and modern person-centered ABA these days is all positive reinforcement. So it's all rewards-based. And it really kind of honours the individual. So it's diversity affirming. It doesn't try and hide the autism or override the autism. It's all about building skills. So looking at what are the functional skills that are lacking and that needs to be built upon. So for Harry, take, for example, the shoe situation, it was all about, we sort of listed a number of skills that we really wanted help with, and one of them was wearing shoes. And so they write this program and they break down this challenging, insurmountable behaviour to its most smallest component parts, and they teach it in this step-by-step fashion. So for Harry, it was, touch a pair of shoes, and immediately he gets rewarded for that. He gets access to all his favourite toys, or if what he wants to do is engage in role play, because he had all these special interests in, the Avengers characters and Harry Potter and Toy Story characters, then the therapist would engage in this elaborate role play with him for 10 minutes. So all he would have to do is touch a shoe, and then he would get this reward. And then the next day they'd run the target again, but maybe he had to put his foot in the shoe for a second, and then he'd get access to the reward. And then the day after, he would have to take 2 steps, and then 3 steps, and 10 steps, and walk out the back door, walk around the house, walk out the front door, and then eventually he walked down the street. And so it was about breaking down these things that seem impossible into these bite-sized chunks. And that was the key to ABA for me. It was about breaking everything down into bite-sized, manageable chunks that even Harry could do, and just building on it in this really painstaking fashion in a way that no parent would ever think to do, or really even have the capacity to do. Because we have this other kid as well. Harry's got a younger sister. They're only 14 months apart, and we just had our hands full. And to have these therapists come in and take over and break down these challenging behaviours and approach it in this totally new way that we had never thought to do before. And in a way that really engaged with Harry. Like he enjoyed these interactions with his therapist, and he had such a great time that his little sister would want to be part of it. So half of our battle was trying to find ways to keep Tessa out of the therapy room or out of the house, keep her entertained at the playground so that Harry wouldn't be interrupted by her, because it was just this fun-filled, play-based, therapy that just looked like play if you weren't, if you were a set of untrained eyes.
Yeah. But that was amazing as well, because Harry had been so avoidant of other people, including his grandparents.
Yes.
That was another major breakthrough.
Yeah. So at its worst, so Harry, like many children on the spectrum, had severe separation anxiety. And it got to a point where we would be in a room and we'd have either a grandparent or a babysitter in the room with us, and we would try and get him to engage directly with the grandparent or the babysitter so that we could give Tessa some attention, so we could turn our attentions to or to ourselves, or we'd try and look on our phone to check some messages. And straight away, the moment we tried to divert his attention from us onto someone else, it would cause an escalation in his behaviour. And so the therapy, when it started, ABA is meant to be one-on-one. It's supposed to be therapist and the child, and the parent shouldn't have to be involved. But for us, because his anxiety was so bad, we were involved, and physically involved. I would hold his hand, or he would sit on my lap. And sometimes especially in that first year, when the therapists were in role play with him, he'd be like, come, I'd have to run from room to room with him and the therapist. And that's how he kept engaged. But over a period of time, months, probably a year before we were really able to disengage and leave him one-on-one, we were able to step back a bit more. So it got to the point where I could cook dinner in the kitchen and he would be playing in the living area, which, you know, he had a line of sight towards me. He knew I was there, but was able to engage with the therapist without me being engaged also. And that was a huge win. It meant that I could, you know, sit down and write this book, which happened in the last few months of his therapy, cook dinner or take a phone call, or, you know, normal things that
you take for granted. Yeah, wow. Your book contains a lot of information about mental health and treatments and medicine. What is your advice to authors around writing about a medical condition of which they have firsthand experience? I think, you know, I'm coming at this from sometimes people feel hesitant, but I think that you should do it. But do it how, and how to gain the confidence and do the research and stuff as well.
Yeah. So there's a lot of books about autism out there, not so much about PDA, although there's a lot in the online forums and on the internet. It's one of those developing areas. And a lot of that information is written like in a self-help kind of narrative, so a prescriptive non-fiction, or you get a lot of clinical and professional books with strategies and therapies that you can use to help your child. And mine is not that. Mine is really a narrative non-fiction. And I think that that's still a really important side to it, because it's the emotional side, and it's the effect that autism has on every member of the family. And so I have tried sort of in every step of this writing process, everything from the cover design to the storytelling style to, I guess, even this kind of talk, to really drive home the fact that this is a story, and what you're getting isn't really a strategy or a solution. It's a story, which hopefully, if you're in a very similar situation, might have some relatable aspects or ideas, but predominantly it's a narrative that you're getting, and hopefully one that fills you with hope and inspiration.
But you've also, you've got endorsements from the Autism Network as well, haven't you? So you've been in touch with them from early on.
So I got an endorsement from Nicole Rogerson, who is the CEO and founder of Autism Awareness Australia, and she herself is a mum of a child with autism. And so this story, I guess, you know, really connected with her. But then the other people who I got endorsements from were clinicians or professionals in the field. So there's a paediatrician and a psychologist. And so it was important for me to, in the writing phase, to make sure that even though this is a narrative, non-fiction, that there was nothing in there that was wrong, you know. So I sent out parts of the chapters to people who are experts in the field and sort of said, can you have a read of this and call it out if there's something blatantly wrong? But, you know, bear in mind, it's a story, it's a narrative. It's not meant to be clinically precise. It's meant to, it's not, the technical aspects shouldn't detract from the story.
It's the emotional accuracy. What was your journey to publication like? Congratulations on the Hawkeye Manuscript Prize. That must have been Manuscript Development Prize. That must have really encouraged you.
Yes. So the path to publication was not straightforward, but in hindsight, it wasn't too bad either. So I was one of those people who was picked up by a literary agent and didn't get a traditional publishing deal. And at the time I was picked up by this agent who has an incredible reputation, I thought I had it in the bag. It's such a big thing to get an agent.
It is. People say it's harder to get an agent than to get a publisher.
Yeah. So I thought I'll just sit back and wait for it to happen. And we went through on multiple rounds of submissions, and the feedback that came back, it was pretty consistent through all the publishing houses. They all really liked the manuscript. They thought it was well put together and well written. They were worried it wasn't going to sell enough copies. Worried it was a really niche market and they didn't know the market, which I think they got wrong, because autism, there's now 1 in 25 kids getting diagnosed. So it's not a little niche market. but I understand it might be a market that they don't understand very well. So I was on submission for about 6 months, and we probably approached, I don't know, 7 or so publishers. There were still another 2 or 3 that my agent thought were worthwhile going to. But I decided to end that process to save my own sanity.
Yeah.
It wasn't, even with an agent, it's a really long, slow process, and it can take months to get a response. And I also know, because I made some submissions on an unsolicited basis, that like it took 8 months to get a response unrepresented. So the whole process just was really open-ended, and you don't know when it's going to end. And I found it was really starting to wreak havoc on my my belief in the manuscript and my sense of confidence. And I'd already been through quite an emotionally testing time with Harry, so my fortitude was quite frayed anyway. And I decided to save my own sanity, and I ended my representation with my agent on really good terms. Like, I'm so glad to have had that opportunity to get the manuscript out there and get feedback that the manuscript was good. But I just wanted to go down a path where I had some certainty.
Yeah, I like being the master of my own destiny. I don't like the decision being out of my hands. Yeah. I get that.
I took that control where I could, basically. Yep. And I had some conversations with the Kind Press, which is a hybrid publisher, much like Hembury Books. And they had this small but beautifully curated list of books that they produced. And my book sort of just slid in one of their genres that they specialised in. And Natasha Gilmore, who's the publisher there, read it, loved it, and really believed in it. And I think did some research into the autism market and probably understood it wasn't, like, it's not that niche. It's
not niche.
And so, you know, I don't regret any of the moves I've made on that front. Like, I feel like I saved my sanity. I've got a road to publication that is clear cut. I've had a 10 out of 10 experience working with the Kind Press.
You've also got a beautiful book. It's a physically beautiful book. The paper is like silk, not reflective. And the cover, did want to ask you about the cover specifically. So it sounds like you completely made the right decision.
I'm 100% comfortable. I've had a satisfying run at trying to get a traditional publishing deal, got some great insights, and now I've got my own.
I think it reflects that just the market, it doesn't reflect you at all. Like, I mean, it's so conservative. The books that are taken on must have sort of mass appeal. Like, we can easily sell 30,000 units. And to me, the kinds of books that have mass appeal may not be the most interesting or the most important anyway. You know, it's just, I don't know, the market's shifting so much. But that said, I think you're going to sell a ton of books. And now you're in control of how you market and promote your books. So that's a plus for you.
Yeah. And I was really aware that there's not many books written about pathological demand avoidance, this emerging area. And I wanted to move quickly on that because there's a couple of books out of the UK. As far as I know, no one in Australia has written a book on it. And no one has really looked at that interplay between pathological demand avoidance and ABA therapy, which for me was the big question. Is ABA going to work for my PDA child, not just an autistic child, but one on the PDA profile? And, you know, this is one family's experience of it, but it's a question of great interest to a lot of people. And I didn't want, you know, this 18-month, 2-year submission process to make me miss my opportunity to be one of the first to tell that story.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also a great parenting yarn. I like you as a parent. What are your goals for the book? Have you got a publicist and stuff?
I do. So Julia Ferricane from Righteous PR will be helping on the publicity for this. My goal for the book, look, obviously the niche market, you know, I understand, and I'm part of that niche market, and I'll work, you know, everything I can to promote the book in that market. But I also really hope that this book appeals to general readers, and that people who have no reason to be reading about autism, pick it up because they've heard it's a compelling read, or they've heard that it's a good story. And I've definitely written it in a way to be accessible and engaging to people who have no experience of autism. And hopefully it gives, the outside world a little bit of a glimpse into what it's like to be part of a family that is touched by autism, and, the challenges that we face.
Do you know what I think? It would be an amazing book for mums groups. What a massive market. I think about my mum's group, the 13 of us, everyone's on their own journey, but you're united by your babies. There's like Inner West mums, massive website with massive readers. And to me, I'd be like, you think you've got it tough with your newborn, try COVID and try autism spectrum disorder. And she got through it. You know what I mean? Like, you can get through it too. And it could just be so great. Like book clubs, you could do online clubs, things like that. And mums would pass it to each other.
Yeah, well, that's definitely the next, that's the phase I'm at now, sort of working out how to get it into people's hands who'll be interested in it. But yeah, definitely mums groups. And look, this isn't exclusively a female story. There's a lot of dads who take on the primary carer role or are the lead parent for a child with autism as well. So, hopefully the message is... It is
so... I just remember, when I was pregnant, I read operating instructions, which really... She became a single parent through her pregnancy. Okay. And I absolutely loved that book. It was sort of, it becomes a holy grail type read because your whole life. So now the cover, I want to ask about the cover. It is a story of, a mum about her son, and you could have gone the pastels, you could have gone the white, but you've gone for black.
Yep.
Can you tell us about the cover design process?
Yes. So there's a few things I wanted to achieve with the cover. The main one was I wanted to distinguish it from all of the prescriptive nonfiction about autism. So I didn't want people to mistakenly pick this up as a self-help book or a book written by a paediatrician or a psychologist, because it's not that. So I wanted to get a cover that sort of would, could be used for a work of fiction or a straight up memoir. So that's what we were aiming for. And because COVID was such a big part of the story, it sort of drives the storyline. I wanted there to be something about a lockdown, and then it just played in really well with the fact that Harry for so long was locked behind his anxiety and this pathologically demand avoidant behaviour, and we were trying to find the key to help him unlock all of that. And so we had a few cover concept conversations, and there were, a few options floating around, but the lock really worked. And I remember showing it to Harry and to Tessa, and they really liked the lock. And we played around with a few different colours. There was green at one point, there was a red version, and Harry said, no, I like the black. And I really like the black. So in the end, I guess Harry sort of helped pick to his story as well.
I love it. What are you doing for your book launch? Can we come?
There will be a book launch. It's probably going to be in early March, and I've had the incredible Anne Freeman, who is a contemporary women's fiction writer here in Melbourne. She has kindly offered to host it. And if you don't know Anne, you've got to find out all about her, because she writes the best books for summer reading. But she's my early endorsers as well. And so we will probably have something in early March. Stay tuned. I'll post the venue. No, not yet. I'm just about to get into that. There's a couple that I'm looking at, but
really,
I'll make sure I get it.
I saw something yesterday on Anne Freedman's Instagram, and it was Northcote Social Club, and that looked pretty amazing.
Yeah, I think that's where she had the launch of her last book. So I'll definitely have to get onto that piece soon.
Best reason for a party. Okay, Porscia, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people learn more about you, and what's your favourite social media platform for connecting with readers?
Yep, so I'm on Instagram and I'm on LinkedIn, and I have a website which I'm learning how to use, it's porcialam.com. But I will try and keep that up to date with, book
All the
launch,
media you're going to get.
all the important stuff. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thanks a lot for talking to us.
Thank you so much, Jess. And can I say happy birthday to Hembury Books? I know you guys just turned 1. I've really enjoyed watching your success.
Yes,
So
thank you.
come on here.
Yeah, no, it's great. And this is I think it will be, we've just crossed the 50 episode mark with the podcast, which has been an absolute joy to get to meet people like yourself. I just love doing it. So it's great. And we'll see what year 2 brings us.
Lovely. Lovely to chat with you, Jess.
Thanks, Porscia.
See ya.